really proud to announce that Zinzino Wellness Revolution is finally coming to India, and we are starting this wellness revolution with our guests today, who will explain what kind of revolution we are bringing here and what kind of solutions we're bringing to fantastic Indian market. Today's your host is Andrew. I'm actively working in India already for 1 year, and I hope that a lot of doctors, nutritionists, and practitioners are participating today in this meeting. And you will have also possibility for those who will watch this to have the recording, or later on we didn't have the time to join us. So today then I'm inviting for the first presentation our very own Dr. Paul Clayton. He's a member of our scientific advisory board. He is really well known in the field of so-called pharmaconutrition. So I'm really proud that he's today with us, and he will present for us the chronic inflammation and long-term problems and how to solve those problems and what is the remedies for that. So Paul, I'm inviting you to share the screen. So I'm stopping to share mine and you can do that.
Okay. So let me just switch to my screen. Hold on. Okay. Well, good evening to everybody in India. I think that everybody knows that chronic inflammation is a problem. It's been identified as a very major cause and driver of what we call the diseases of civilization, largely non-communicable degenerative diseases. So people have heard the phrase, but do they all understand what it is? I think in many cases, we don't know exactly what it is. And if you don't know what it is and you don't know what causes it, we can't do much about it. The science has progressed, and we are now at a point where we have a reasonably good understanding of what causes chronic inflammation and how that leads to disease. And perhaps most importantly, what we have discovered are a series of quite simple dietary strategies that we can use to interfere with this process, to reduce the burden of chronic inflammation, and then hopefully with time, do something to reduce the terrible burden of public health that is affecting not only India, but it has become a problem worldwide. And I would say the problem is indeed so prevalent that broadly, the medical profession in its current orientation has failed. We have all kinds of treatments we can use to treat the symptoms of disease, but even although we can help to some extent those people who come to see us in our surgeries and our offices, in the background, public health is in a terrible place, and it's getting worse. And I'm going to show you some health statistics from a few countries to show you how universal this problem is. These are all government statistics. And I'll start with Australia because there is an image that Australians are healthy, hearty, outdoors people. But in fact, nothing of the sort is the case. If you look at the government stats, slightly over half, in fact, it's a little bit over 50% of all adult Australians have at least one chronic degenerative disease, and almost a quarter have two or more. This is not a healthy population. If we cross the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific, depending on which way you travel around the world, and go to Denmark in Europe, 2 in 3 adult Danes have a chronic health condition. And if you look at different age groups, you see that the frequency, the number of conditions that they have increases as we go up the age range. Now, you think it's normal, this is a pretty average kind of picture, for people to develop more chronic health problems as we get older. That appears to be normal, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that this is in fact an artifact. This is the result of chronic intoxication caused by the way in which we live, and that we do not have to become unhealthier as we age. I'll jump back across the Atlantic to the United States. And the United States, which is where I currently am, think of themselves as being exceptional, as we all know. In fact, from a health perspective, they are not. In fact, they're slightly unhealthier than anybody else. 60% of American adults have one chronic disease, and 40%, almost half of them, have two or more chronic conditions. This is a devastating indictment of the American way of life. It shows how deeply unhealthy it is. And if we look at older adult Americans, more than 50% of them have more than 3 degenerative diseases, which is why the Americans, who collectively constitute about 5 to 6% of the global population, are currently consuming 55% of all the prescribed pharmaceuticals in the world. It is a deeply sick society. Current trends are extremely negative, and one of the reasons for that is the way we live, the way we eat, and these things conspire to make us heavier. This is an OECD analysis of national survey data. You can see that everyone is getting heavier. Americans are in the lead, Mexico close behind, the UK and Canada making up the third and fourth. And as we get heavier, the risk of many different types of pathologies increase. Now, you can quickly scan the list, but I won't go into all of them. I'll simply focus on NIDDM, non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, or type 2 diabetes. And you can see that the risk increases as you go from normal weight through the overweight of the different categories of obesity. It doubles, increases 5 times, 8 times, 12 times. And the problem is that once you have been diagnosed as a diabetic, and it depends whose statistics you read, you're going to lose life expectancy. So these problems, all of these problems are spiraling out of control. And as a result, we're seeing a huge increase in people dying young, dying excessively young, dying from preventive illnesses. We're seeing huge increases in the frequency of non-alcohol related fatty liver disease, end-stage renal disease. These are affecting huge numbers of people, and we don't have enough surgeons to carry out all the transplants that are needed. And if we did, I'm not sure we'd be able to source enough organs to transplant into all of these unnecessarily unhealthy people. If we look at another aspect of this metabolic imbalance that categorizes type 2 diabetes, hypertension, now affecting almost 50% of American adults. And if we add in pre-hypertension, which is already a damaging condition, and we know over time tends to move into clinical hypertension, that is at least another 10 to 15%. So we're looking at a situation where almost 2/3 of the American public, at least the adult section of that public, are clearly suffering from a significant metabolic imbalance, which will over time make them ill and which will over time kill them. This is relatively trivial, cataracts and an annoyance, hardly life-threatening, but if you're diabetic, the risk increases. And because there are more diabetics, they're becoming diabetic earlier in life, we're seeing an increased need for cataract surgery. Now, I mentioned the fact that we're seeing diabetes earlier in life. When I went to medical school in 1968, I was taught that diabetes was a disease of old age. No longer the case. We're seeing it occurring in progressively younger cohorts of patients, and it's not unusual now to see type 2 diabetics in their 20s, teens, or even pre-teens. And this is a very common picture. And it's true of almost all of the other chronic degenerative diseases. They're increasing in frequency. At the same time, they're decreasing in latency. We're seeing them emerge in progressively younger groups of patients. This is a population that is being chronically poisoned. But before I ask you to accept that on faith, let me show you a few more symptoms. We know that the diabetic is more at risk of dementia. There is a huge metabolic overlap between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's. I don't think it is correct to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. It's clearly more complicated than that. But we've seen this huge increase in dementias since 1950. Per age group, the numbers have increased by 250%. And as with type 2 diabetes, it is emerging in progressively younger groups of subjects. So since 1980, the average age of onset of dementia has fallen by 15 years. Within 40 years, it has fallen by 15 years. It is a huge, dramatic, extremely negative trend. And because once you've been diagnosed with dementia, and in fact, this is true of all the neurodegenerative diseases, we have no cures. We can just tinker around with some of the symptoms, not very successfully. Because the disease progresses over time, in the older age ranges, more people are dying. So since 1950, the deaths in the over 75 group from dementia, from the neurodegenerative death in general, have increased by 300% in men and 500% in women. I'll link that with depression, because we know that depression, now regarded as a neuroprogressive disorder, causes progressive neuronal damage. And in fact, a history of depressive illness, as I'm sure you know, is a risk factor for dementia. And depression too is increasing. In fact, it's been doubling with every generation for the last 2 generations. And as with the dementias, as with diabetes, we're not only seeing an increase in the numbers of people affected with depression, but the age of onset is falling. It's fallen by 16 years since 1988, very much in parallel with the declining age of onset of dementia. So the fact that depression is increasing means that in the fullness of time, we will see further increases in the numbers of patients who are presenting with dementia, surely as night follows day. And another reason why we're going to see more cases, and this is a condition which is already posing a huge medical and financial, mediconomic burden. We know that it's going to continue to increase because of the increase in obesity. Again, very tightly linked to dementia, to diabetes, dementia. That there's a series of connections which all overlap, but that increases the risk of by up to 300%. Now, I will say, for the sake of fairness, that the Alzheimer's Cohorts Consortium has identified a negative trend. I'm not sure I believe this data, and I believe any changes that they have seen will be overwhelmed by the continuing increase in depression and obesity. So something appears to be damaging our central nervous systems in the later stages of life. It's doing the same things in the early stages of life. If we look at the neurodevelopmental disorders, there's a lot of evidence indicating that the increase in ADD, ADHD, dysphasia, dyspraxia, this whole constellation of neurodevelopmental disorders, these are all showing fairly consistently an increase, as we have seen with autism. Moving from the central nervous system to the connective tissues, specifically the skeletal system, we're seeing an increase in low impact fractures, indicating that there has been a deterioration of our skeletal quality. And there is evidence for cartilaginous degeneration as well, with the huge increases in the demand for knee and hip replacement, partly driven by the increasing body weight, which I mentioned in the first couple of slides, but there is evidence of a degeneration of cartilage chemistry as well. Now let's quickly jump over to the immune system. I think everyone is familiar with the idea that asthma has increased very dramatically in the last 20 years, but along with asthma, we've seen parallel increases in similar allergic conditions, such as conjunctive rhinitis dermatitis, and the eosinophilic gastrointestinal disorders, which you can think of in a way as asthma, an asthma-like condition affecting the gastrointestinal tract. And then you have the autoimmune diseases, most of which seem to be increasing year on year on year also. Nobody has a very clear idea why this is. We have some hypotheses. These remain to be tested. So a lot of conditions are increasing more frequently. They're increasing in age-matched populations. We're seeing them emerge typically in younger populations as well. And I can't really leave this very brief survey of public health behind without at least mentioning the cancers. So since 1950, there has been an approximate doubling of the non-tobacco related cancers, and one of them in particular, non-tobacco related lung cancer, has doubled since 2012 in a very short period of time. And this is from a very well-respected cancer epidemiologist. The oncologists among you will be aware of the fact that non-tobacco related lung cancer is not the most significant numerically form of lung cancer. The numbers are relatively small, but the trends are very significant and deeply alarming. And this is not because societies are getting older. I'll show you data soon to show you that we're not, in fact, aging as a societies, because we see the same increase in teens and young adults. And one of these cancers in particular, bowel cancer in the 22 to 37-year-old group, has increased 4 times since 1974. And this from another very well-respected cancer epidemiologist. It's again, as with non-tobacco related lung cancer, this is not the most numerically significant of the cancers, but the trends, as with non-tobacco related lung cancer, are very significant and deeply worrying. Now, Many of you, I'm sure, are young and healthy. You don't have these types of diseases and you don't feel personally involved. I would like to suggest to you that you should. And the reason for that is that all of the diseases that I've described have long latent preclinical periods. They develop for most of their life cycle under the surface. They are preclinical, they are asymptomatic. You have a gradual and progressive loss of cartilage for many years before it emerges as clinical arthritis and the pain and disability. You're losing bone, osteoid and mineralized bone for decades before a fracture. Atheroma is building up in the arteries for 40, 50 years before a heart attack, which means that people who are younger and who are not symptomatic should not relax because they probably have one or more of these diseases in preclinical form. And we know this because when we look at healthy young adults, we find that about 1 in 5 have NASH, which is they're moving towards chronic liver disease. About 1 in 4 are moving towards osteoporosis. As you can see, 1 in 5 healthy non-diabetic adults are moving towards coronary artery disease, hypertension, and stroke. And if we were to include diabetics in that cohort, that number jumps from 22% to approximately 63%, I think the last time I looked. About 1 in 5, that's the ARCD phenomenon, about 1 in 5 healthy middle-aged adults are gradually declining and towards dementia. They're starting to become more forgetful, not yet clinically diagnosable as being demented, but they are definitely going in that direction. And perhaps most worryingly of all, almost half of adults between 40 and 49 are moving towards sarcopenia, with all the many complications that that brings in its wake. This is our new normal. This is indicative of a population that is being chronically intoxicated, and I'll return to that, but it's not inevitable. What we see when we look at vestigial groups, these are typically small groups of people in very remote parts of the world who are living something that is more like a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and diet. They do not age in the way that we do. What we see when we find a young vestigial who has been perhaps killed in a hunting accident or some sort of trauma, open them up, they have no evidence of developing coronary artery disease whatsoever, which is quite unlike the position in most of India, in the United States, and in Europe. And as these people get older, there is no age-related rise in blood pressure, no age-related increase in insulin resistance, no age-related increase in BMI. They simply do not age in the way that we do, and they do not develop chronic degenerative diseases in the way that we do. The cause of all this, poor diet. This is a recurrent analysis that is carried out by the United States Institutes of Health Metrics and Evaluation. They crunch the biggest of big data and they come up with this conclusion, pretty much the same thing every year. It is our terrible diet that is making us sick and killing us prematurely. Not only that, I already showed you some data to show it's damaging our brains, it's making us stupid. Our average IQ is in decline. We have lost almost 15 points since 1950 on average, and our sperm counts are falling. We're being damaged in many, many different ways. And perhaps this may come as a surprise to some of you, our testosterone levels are falling too. I'm referring exclusively to the men in the audience here, of course, as well. And we're familiar with the idea of increases in female infertility related to such issues as polycystic ovary syndrome, which again is tied tightly to increasing weight and metabolic imbalance. But we're seeing also increasing numbers of males presenting with subclinical infertility and frank infertility. And if we continue in this direction, we are going to be moving towards uncontrolled population involution within a generation, which will be a chaotic and very probably violent disaster. Many, many different interlocking problems here. The medical profession in its current modality has been completely unable to do anything about this. I'm not even sure if they recognize this. We have been focusing on treating the symptoms of those people who are already sick and who come to us for help. We need to look at the wider perspective, the wider context, and take into consideration a population, a general public, that is in a terribly unhealthy configuration. What, if anything, can we do about that? Well, firstly, we know where to attack it. We know to deal with this. We have to, because this is what drives chronic inflammation. Very interesting diagram, very simplified. I won't go into all of this because most of this is what is taking place inside your immune cells. In this case, a macrophage, or it could be a mast cell, or a natural killer cell, or a neutrophil. I won't talk about what's going on inside the cell. Perhaps we can do that on another occasion, but I want to talk about the inflammasome. That's that orange bar at the bottom, which is where what happens inside the cell is translated into what that cell then does to the extracellular space around it and the cells that surround it, and how it damages healthy tissue. Now that double parallel line, those two parallel lines running across the top of the slide are, of course, a schematic of your typical cell membrane, which is a phosphatidyl phospholipid bilayer. Into those membranes, we incorporate different types of fatty acids, such as arachidonic acid over on the left, which is an omega-6, and EPA and DHA, which are omega-3 fatty acids. And the ratio with which we incorporate these fatty acids into the cell membrane is determined by the ratio of those fatty acids and their precursors in your diet. Let's say you have been challenged by some sort of inflammatory stimulus, which is what happens to us many times every day. And that could be a pathogen. It could be a degree of physical breakdown or trauma. Once that happens, you need to be able to mount an inflammatory response. An acute inflammatory response is absolutely essential. We need that to live, to survive, to adapt. And we start the inflammatory response with arachidonic acid. At the top of the sequence, you have PLA2, which then acts on the phosphatidyl phospholipids, releases arachidonic acid, and that is broken down into pro-inflammatory eicosanoids and cytokines and drives the inflammatory reaction. And then hopefully you're able to overcome the pathogen, you're able to clear the damaged tissue, and now you have to stop the inflammatory sequence. And we do that with EPA and DHA, the omega-3s. When they are metabolized, they break down into anti-inflammatory eicosanoids and these pro-resolving lipid mediators, resolvins, protectins, and maressins, really interesting compounds, and they stop the inflammation and bring you back to where you were before you were challenged. So you need both. If you want to remain in good health, you have to be able to mount the inflammation sequence in response to a challenge, and you have to be able to stop it once the challenge has been removed. You can think of this as something rather like the accelerator and the brake on a car. And if you're driving around in Mumbai or New Delhi, which I have done, you will know, of course, that you need the accelerator and the brake. You need to be able to use them both proportionately, depending on what challenges other road users are throwing at you. And so it is in life, in terms of our cells and our metabolisms. We need to be able to have the right ratio of omega-6s to apply the accelerator. We need to have the right amounts of omega-3s to apply the brakes, to have acute inflammatory responses without them bleeding off to become chronic inflammatory sequences, which are very tissue damaging. Now, this is another way of looking at it, an even simpler way. We can think of the inflammasome. That's what comes from the last slide but one. And I want to show you where the omega-6s and the omega-3s come in. You can think of the inflammasome as a sequence with two chambers. And in the upper chamber, or first, the proximal chamber, it is absolutely to do with your 6:3 ratio in your cell membranes, which reflects the 6:3 ratio in your diet. If you're hit by an inflammatory challenge, then the 6s and the 3s, they start to break down. You have enough of the 6s, not too many of the 3s, got to get it in the right ratio. And these immune cells are constantly shedding exosomes. You have little bits of local changes, edema, the accumulation of other immune cells and things like that. But these immune cells are shedding little particles called exosomes. We used to call them cell dust until we knew what they were. They're being released outside the cell, and they break down and they release cathepsins, proteases, matrix metalloproteases. And these matrix metalloproteases are extremely destructive, very, very destructive. They cause widespread tissue destruction. And this is part of the sequence whereby you remove damaged tissue, but you don't want to remove too much. And one of the ways in preventing you from removing and breaking down too much tissue is these compounds called polyphenols. And these polyphenols are super important. The Indian diet contains quite significant amounts of them, and they have the ability not only to block the enzymes, the matrix metalloproteases, very directly. It's a simple enzymatic inactivation, but they also downregulate the genes which express for matrix metalloproteases. So they have a very important anti-inflammatory role to play. And if you're eating the right diet, which is a good 6:3 ratio, not too much 6, but enough 3, and plenty of polyphenols, you will have excellent health because you'll be able to meet challenges, but you will not degenerate into chronic inflammatory stress and disease. But here's where the problem starts. The modern diet has vastly increased the ratio of 6s to 3s. Instead of being about 2-to-1, 3-to-1, we are now in Europe, we are at an average of 15-to-1. The United States and Canada are about 25-to-1. And the ratio in India, from what we have seen, is even higher. What that means is that the first sequence in the inflammatory cascade is overheating. And then the second thing that has happened in many parts of the world is that the polyphenols have been removed from the diet. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And what that means is that the second chamber in the inflammatory sequence is also overheating. And so more and more and more of these matrix metalloproteases are being released into the tissues where they break down the extracellular matrix. Now, this is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers which runs through every cubic micrometer of your body. And its function is to hold your cells together in the right coordination so that they can communicate with each other, function collectively as tissues and organs. And these microfibers include half a dozen different types of collagen, laminectin, elastin, and a range of proteoglycans and glycosaminoglycans. It's a very complex organ, very important one, and it's all about organization and structure. That is your soft skeleton. The matrix metalloproteases dissolve all these fibers and turn structure into chaos. Tissue dissolves and melts. Now, if you're familiar with these matrix metalloproteases, and I think you may well have heard of these, it's because they are the same enzymes that are released by the flesh-eating bacteria. If you are unlucky enough to be infected by a flesh-eating bacterium, it is releasing large amounts of these very destructive matrix metalloproteases into the tissues over a short period of time, and they dissolve everything. They dissolve bone, cartilage, skin, ligament, muscle, everything. And it is those same enzymes that are being released in much smaller amounts over much longer periods of time that are the hallmark of chronic inflammation. And that is why chronic inflammation leads to the slow, progressive destruction of healthy tissue that we call chronic degenerative disease, whether it's in your joints, your bones, your arteries, or your brain. Now, our ratios of 6:3 have been in steady decline since 1900 because of changes in the food processing, and our intake of polyphenols in most of the world has declined by almost 90% because of changes in our appetites, food intakes, and in plant genetics. And here are the people who are basically killing us. These are the people who are poisoning us and killing us before our time. A very small number of multinational food companies who collectively control a very large percentage of the global food space. Now, none of these foods are dangerous. If you go home after you've listened to this webinar and you eat a bowl of cereal or eat a bar of chocolate, that's not going to do anything. You'll wake up tomorrow and you'll be fine. But if you eat too many of these foods for too long a period of time, they most certainly will make you sick, and they will kill you because they cause chronic inflammation and type B malnutrition. I'll talk about that in a bit. Here's why they cause chronic inflammation. They have a very high 6:3 ratio. In fact, the omega-3s that we need to prevent excessive inflammation have almost disappeared. They have removed the polyphenols. Why? Well, if you were to eat, let's say, an apple, typically you would eat the whole apple, including the skin. Some of you may eat the core as well. Now, where would you find the polyphenols in an apple? They're in the skin and the core. They're there to protect the fruit of the apple and the seeds. When one of these companies buys an apple, they take off the peel, remove the core, and use the apple pulp, which is mostly fiber, water, a little bit of sugar, but the polyphenols have gone. That's just one example. They take away prebiotic fibers and 1,3,1,6 beta glucans as well, all for different reasons. And that means that there is chronic inflammation in the intestines and that the immune system can't work properly. So the four most important anti-inflammatory nutrients in our diets have really been significantly reduced. They've been taken away. So what do these food companies give us in return? They give us advanced glycation products, advanced lipoxidation products, and lipopolysaccharide. The first two because they use food production methods which use extremely high temperatures, much higher than we would use in our kitchens. And LPS, that's a rather complex issue which I can discuss in the question and answers if you want to, once this presentation is over. And then they damage us in another way as well, because they stuff all of their foods with sugar. Now those sugars, many of them are hidden. They're not obvious. They're not just confectionery, cakes or biscuits, but they'll stuff it into products like tomato ketchup, which is 30% sugar by weight. And you can't taste that because the ketchup is full of vinegar and spices, which kind of overlay the sugar. But who knew that this common condiment was supplying you with so much sugar? In fact, when you look at sugar consumption, and this is the United States, but I know that India is moving in the same direction, you can see how much sugar consumption has increased over the last century. It's gone into a bit of a plateau, perhaps a slight decline at the moment, but nonetheless, this is a huge amount of sugar. And of course, these are empty calories, completely empty. And that leads to a situation where chronic inflammatory stress is absolutely normal. We see it all around us. And it accounts for the waves of chronic degenerative disease that we see today, that we've all experienced in our friends, in our families, and that are destroying our public health. It's worse than that, and that is bad enough, because this is a diet that not only causes chronic inflammation, it also starves us. It causes malnutrition type B. Now, chronic inflammatory stress means you're destroying more tissue than you should. If you're malnourished, your ability to replace and regenerate that missing tissue is in decline. And if your rate of tissue destruction is up, your rate of tissue healing is down, it means you're in a net catabolic condition, which means that over time you will lose healthy functional tissue. You will move towards clinical disease. This hasn't been particularly well recognized by the medical profession, because when we were at medical school, we were taught that type A malnutrition looks like that. And we see occasionally patients like that, but they're not very common except in certain parts of the world. What we see is type B malnutrition, which is characterized by people who are low in vitamins, trace elements, carotenoids, polyphenols, cyanogens, methyl group donors, conditionally essential amino acids and amino sugars, and many, many other things besides. But the one thing they have enough of, and very often too much of, is calories. So what does that look like? It looks like these young kids. Now they are eating hamburgers, shakes, and fries, which means they have chronic inflammatory stress. But that is a diet that also contains very low levels of almost all micro and phytonutrients. So they have type B malnutrition as well, which is why they already have heart disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, dementia in preclinical form. They're not yet showing these symptoms, but they already have these diseases in their body at an early preclinical stage. They're eating all these ultra-processed foods. Now, what is ultra-processed? The most widespread definition is the NOVA scheme, and that simply says if it's processed, you can probably look at it and see what's in it. If it's ultra-processed, it'll have 6 or more ingredients, and by looking at it, you can't tell what the starting materials were. And here are some examples: sugar-sweetened beverages, Coca-Cola and drinks like that, candy, ice cream, breakfast cereals, all the things you like to eat. In fact, all the foods that children find nearly addictive, which is not surprising because the food industry designs them to be addictive, but they're really bad for you. They're pro-inflammatory, they starve you internally, and they don't satiate, which is why the more you eat of those ultra-processed foods, the more likely you are to become overweight and obese. And this has been shown time and time again. And because you're overweight, and because you have chronic inflammatory stress, and because you have malnutrition, the people who are the heaviest, who are eating the most of these foods, actually have the worst nutritional status. It's an apparent contradiction, but it actually makes sense when you realize that these people are getting fat on largely empty calories. And because they're empty, because they have chronic inflammatory stress and malnutrition, the more you eat of these ultra-processed foods, the more you die. A 10% increase in the risk of cancer and a 14 to 50% increased risk of type 2 diabetes and early death in general. It also drives immunological aging, increased inflammation, and an increased risk of sepsis. Now, let me just make it clear that this last study is a preclinical study. It was done with rats, because guess what? Rats love these foods in the same way that we do. They really are designed to be addictive. Rats will eat as much of them as they can get, and when they do, their health and life expectancy drops. Increased inflammation, advanced immunological aging, increased risk of sepsis, just as we do. We are progressively becoming unhealthier for exactly these reasons. And this is a fascinating paper that I would recommend all of you to read. And it has created a situation where life expectancy is now falling. For the last 4 years in the United States, and it's not just deaths of despair. If you look at the data, it's death rates from all major causes, including sepsis, as with the lab rats, diabetic complications, the increase in diabetes, neurodegenerative, which is what we talked about at the very beginning. In the United Kingdom, death rates have been increasing since 2017, life expectancy falling there, and it's going to start falling in all of these other countries very soon. I think it may already be starting to fall in vulnerable groups in India, because that reflects the extent to which we eat these ultra-processed foods, these pro-inflammatory, depleted foods. North America is consuming almost 60% of their calories in the form of these disastrously toxic foods. Britain comes next, 50.7% over a year ago. It's now about 51.5 from the latest data that I've seen. And then you can see Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Finland. They're coming up next. And I believe that we're seeing huge increases in the consumption of ultra-processed foods in select consumer groups in India as well. So what should you do? I think that first of all, you should change your diet. Now, one example of a healthier diet is the so-called Mediterranean diet, which itself is dying off, because we know that that reduces the risk of many, many degenerative disease. It says here, halves the risk. It's up to half. In some cases, it's more like a third. But this is clearly very protective. We have identified a diet that is even more protective, which is called the mid-Victorian diet. It is the diet and lifestyle that people followed in the second half of the 19th century in England, which was made possible by two things. The agricultural revolution, which hugely improved and increased agricultural productivity, large amounts of fresh fruits, vegetables, grain, and fresh meat coming into the cities because we had the Industrial Revolution. So all this food could come into the cities very quickly to where people lived and worked, and they were working with their backs and with their hands. Britain at that time was known as the workshop of the world. An extraordinarily healthy culture. And we have investigated this in great detail. I actually published the first papers about this, working together with Dr. Judith Robotham, who is a very well-known historian from that period. If we look at the mid-Victorians, they had no computers, no televisions, no internal combustion engines, and so they are a predominantly manually occupied society. They are predominantly blue collar. The middle class is small, the aristocracy is tiny. Most people are blue collar. They're working physically 10 hours a day, 5.5 to 6 days a week. They walk back and from work. Their leisure involves physical activity. It works out to about 60 to 75 hours of physical activity a week. These people aren't going to the gym once or twice a week. Effectively, they're living in a gymnasium, which means they have huge appetites. Women are eating between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day. That's very typical. Men are consuming from 3,000 to 7,000 calories a day. And yet, from the photographs I showed you just a moment ago, you can see that they were all very slim. Overweight and obesity hardly occurred in that society at all, because they are consuming those calories and using them in physical activity. And what they're eating is extraordinarily healthy. They're eating a lot of basic produce, very little salt, tobacco, spirits, or processed foods, very, very little. They're eating fruits and vegetables and meat and fish. There is nothing else. Lots of omega-3s, because at that time, oysters and wild salmon were the foods of the poor. Hard to believe, I know, but they were staples for the poorer people. Very little omega-6 because omega-6 from plant oils had not yet been stabilized by industry. 10 or more portions of fruit and vegetables a day, which may sound like a lot. But if you're burning 4,000 calories a day, it's easy. And I should know because I tried living like a Victorian for 4 months in 2009, I think, 2010. And I was hungry all the time. Eating 10 portions of fruit and vegetables a day was absolutely easy to do. This is a super Mediterranean diet, and it should be manifest in their life expectancies. And we found indeed that it was. Now, if we look at mid-Victorian women, and we have to compare them with the equivalent socioeconomic class today, that is effectively working class women, C1 and D, we can see that women have gained 3 years of life expectancy since the mid-Victorian era. And that is solely because of family planning and improved obstetrics. And those are 2 of the major advances of 20th century medicine. And I would defend those absolutely. But look at men. Men have actually lost 3 years of life expectancy, despite modern medicine, despite modern surgery, screening techniques, and all the rest. We have actually moved backwards. We've lost 3 years of life expectancy, and we've lost a good deal more of health expectancy. Now, we can expect to spend today about 10% of our lives in progressive medical decline, in progressive pharmaceutical dependency. We die very slowly and very expensively. That was not true in the 19th century. We know that once the Victorians were too old to work in the fields or in the factories, they were sent to something called a workhouse, which meant exactly what the name implies. They had to work to cover their expenses, and we know that they did until the last days or indeed hours before they died, and they would typically die not of chronic degenerative disease, but of overwhelming infection. Yes, they had cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, but at a very low rate. So this in a population that was approximately our age, our life expectancy, but the frequency of chronic degenerative disease far, far lower than we see it today. And we're very confident in these data because we had access to autopsy reports, tens of thousands of them that were carried out by the doctors of the day, who could not diagnose these conditions as early as we can, but could and did diagnose them at the point of death without prejudice. Other people have looked at this data, this time, and the available evidence. They've come to the same conclusion. This is what we die of today. In England and Wales, you can see that the 2 leading causes of death are cancers and diseases of the circulatory system. Between them, they kill about 2/3 of us. We consider that to be normal. In the mid-Victorian era, those 2 diseases together account for only 6%. In other words, 1/10 of the rates that we see them today, which tells you 2 things. Firstly, 90% of the burden of chronic degenerative disease that we see today is unnecessary and avoidable. And secondly, that 10% figure should be ringing bells with many of you. Ask an oncologist, a neurogeriatrician, a cardiologist, how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors? And they'll typically say about 10%. In the Victorian era, it is only that 10% who have these strong genetic risk factors who are developing these diseases. Everybody else is protected. For the oncologists, I'll just skim this. We've been through a list of factors that we know are protective or increase the risk of cancer, and we can list them very quickly: obesity, adipokines, hypoglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, insulin growth factors, inflammatory compounds, cooked meat carcinogens, the ability to excrete them, AMP-mTOR axis, which is related to physical activity. They are all protective in the Victorian. They are all destructive in today's Indian or European or American. Now, cancer cells are probably forming in your body constantly, many per day, but our defenses cope with them. But if you look at the Victorian, you can see that these cancer cells have nowhere to go. We have many defenses against cancer. We have evolved multiple defenses against them, obviously for evolutionary reasons. And in the Victorian, every one of those lines of defense is reinforced and well maintained. A cancer cell emerging in the body of a Victorian has nowhere to go. It cannot survive, it cannot prosper, and it dies. Over on the right of the slide, you see the very different configuration of a 21st century person. All of our defenses are down, which means that as those cancer cells continue to form, it is overwhelmingly likely that one or more of them will have an opportunity to grow, to progress, to develop, and to become clinically significant. And that is enough in itself to explain the enormous increase in the incidence of cancer and, by implication, all of the other chronic degenerative diseases that are now overwhelming our healthcare systems. So where do we start? How can we do something about this? How can we reduce the burden of chronic ill health? Well, the first thing to note is that in a citizen today who is eating too many of these ultra-processed foods, first of all, they have a very high omega-6 to 3 ratio in their diet and therefore in their cell membranes, and they don't have very many polyphenols, which means they are suffering from chronic inflammatory stress, which may show up as arthritis, as coronary artery disease, as a progressive liver disease. It may be asthma or a chronic obstructive lung disease. It could be migraine, epilepsy, or a neurodegenerative condition. All of these illnesses are driven by chronic inflammatory stress. We think of them as very different diseases, but actually they have a great deal in common, and they can all be regarded as different manifestations of a common underlying problem. There is a solution. I've posed it as a question here. Is there a solution? But there most definitely is. What we do is we put out the flames, and we do so using a rather special combination of omega-3s, EPA, DHA, and some very, very unique lipophile polyphenols, which have the ability, unlike most polyphenols, to dissolve into the oil phase, into the lipids, to attach to them. In fact, these are what nature created as chaperones for these types of unstable lipid molecules, and travel with them into the body, allow them to be deposited in the peripheral tissues, and then the polyphenols and the omega-3s together act to damp down the inflammatory cascade. And that is enough in many cases to tell the disease to go into remission or to disappear. And we've seen this in tens of thousands of cases. I don't think we want to medicalize everyone. Not everybody needs to take supplements, but we should at least find out who needs them. And one way of doing that is to use the Zinzino balance test, which is a very easy to use self-help test that you can do at home. You send that off to the into the post. It'll go to an independent third-party laboratory, and then Essent oil will give you the omega-3s and the polyphenols together in one very easy to take complex, which will damp those inflammatory flames. And as you take the Essent oil, it will reduce the 6:3 ratio in your membranes, and you can monitor that by taking a retest at 120 days. And we know from an enormous database that if you use Essent oil to manipulate and to modify your cell membranes and bring them back into a state of balance, then in the vast majority of cases, within 120 days, you will have brought your 6:3 ratio back to below 5. And at that point, inflammatory stress will fade and in many cases disappear. I'm not saying that Essent oil is a panacea. It's not. We cannot do very much, if anything, to assist those people who have these conditions because of strong genetic risk factors. But in the vast majority of cases, in 9 cases out of 10, in fact, the evidence indicates that using Essent oil, we can reduce inflammatory stress and reduce the burden of symptoms and address the underlying condition itself in a way that I hesitate to call curative, but it is something that we can use to improve our health at the public health level and personally. I've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, and I apologize if it's probably I've gone too rapidly for many people. I'm sure the medics and the clinical scientists will have kept up with me with great ease, and some of you will be further ahead, and I'm sure you'll have questions to ask. But for those who are interested in knowing more, my books have been translated, I think, into over 30 languages by now, but they include Hindi. And I believe they're going to be available in Tamil as well. And this is a do-it-yourself guide, a very straightforward and easy way of changing your diet changing some food choices, changing food cooking, cooking techniques as well. Very simple things that you can do to reduce your burden of chronic inflammatory stress and to improve your overall nutritional profile in a way which will move you out of that 9 out of 10 people and will improve your long-term health prospects and will do a great deal to improve your short-term health problems as well.